Hi. Just a short lecture this week as we start to think about how you reckon with a dirty war. One crucial question that is part of that larger question of reckoning is who was responsible for the dirty war? And so that's something I want to think a little bit about in this lecture this week, and that we'll talk more about in the time that we have left in the course. So the past few weeks we've been talking a lot about the mechanics of the dirty war. Last week I wanted you to think a lot about how the genocide wasn't just about establishing fear, but it was also about reorganizing society, about managing society, destroying social relationships that were based on autonomy and cooperation, and creating new social relationships that were based on obedience and respect for authority and respect for the state and respect for the family. Now, though, I want to turn and think a little bit more about the role that the middle class played during this time, how they explained the disappearances. So there's a historian, Sebastián Carrassi. He has a book out. It's called The Argentine Silent Majority. And in that book, he articulates this idea, the civil superstition, which I know I've talked about before. The idea of the civil superstition is this belief that the state must know what it's doing, that the state has its reasons. And Sebastián Carrassi argues that that civil superstition helps explain why so many people in Argentina basically stood by why this happened and how they justified it to themselves. So it's quite clear that the ordinary Argentine might not have known the magnitude of the dirty war, but most people did know people were disappearing. And what Carrassi noticed when he did oral histories with Argentines who lived through this era was that a contradiction emerged in their memories. He would, in the same interview, they would say, so-and-so was disappeared. It must be because of something. But they also acknowledged that some people who had nothing to do with the guerrilla movement were chupados, which was the term that was used, means sucked up by the military, right? Chupados, disappeared. They believed in the power and the rightness of the state, even though they recognized that the state created chaos. But their belief was that it sheltered them from more chaos. One way that Sebastián Carrassi put it in his book was that the state knows or should know why it does what it does. And this is a superstition, and hopefully we can talk more about this in the time to come. There was, however, one group of people, particular that I want to talk about, who were not willing to stand by while the human rights were brutalized, and that's the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. Some people thought that no crime merited the kind of torture and disappearance that was happening in Argentina. And to be clear, there had been several organizations that had been lobbying for the release of prisoners and lobbying for information. Groups like Servicio Paz y Justicia, which was an ecumenical movement for human rights. There was the Permanent Assembly for Human Rights. But human rights lawyers themselves were targeted for disappearance. And so what emerges is that the most effective people who could advocate for the disappeared and fight for information were the relatives, and specifically the mothers. So mothers in Argentina, in 1977, they began to meet at the Plaza de Mayo, which is the seat of the Argentine government, and where there's a giant obelisk located in front of it's called the Casa Rosada. We might think of it as the Argentine White House. In 1813, after Argentina had declared independence from Spain, they burned down the plaza because it had been used to torture and burn heretics during the Inquisition. And so it was a site, the obelisk was a note to the Argentine public that there was no room for torture in enlightened Argentina, in independent Argentina. And so Saturday, April 30th, 1977, a group of 11 mothers met at the Plaza de Mayo to protest the disappearance of their children, and they'd continue meeting there every Thursday for years to come. So You might ask yourself why fathers weren't involved. And the simple fact is that ideas about gender meant that mothers were a little bit more protected, although not fully protected. Some of them themselves were attacked for their activism. But these women, and their numbers began to grow, quickly became the Achilles heel of the movement. And I want you to think about why that might be. What contradictions did they expose in the regime and in the rhetoric of the dirty war? If you remember at the beginning, I said that the Argentine military wanted to reorganize society, create new social relationships that were based on respect for authority, respect for the state, and respect for the family, right? But here were women and mothers and elderly women saying that their families had not been respected. What they did was expose the lie underneath the regime's discourse of paternalism, and they exposed the lie that the regime was creating order. They exposed the chaos, in essence. These women, they became very, very successful. They met with heads of state. They met with Catholic representatives of the Catholic Church. They even criticized the Catholic Church for not doing more to protest the human rights abuses in Argentina. And like I said earlier, they were attacked and beaten and jailed, and their leaders were disappeared, and the military set dogs on them. But they continued to protest, and in fact, they continue to organize to this day, seeking more information about their loved ones who have yet to be found. The other thing going on in this period was that there was growing pressure from human rights groups abroad. So activists like the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo were getting the word out, spreading the word. So were exiles. They were going to embassies. They were talking about disappearances. They were talking about the camps. They were holding protests at embassies abroad. And foreign governments began to get involved too, particularly when their own citizens were caught up in the dragnet of the dirty war. So 2 French nuns, for example, were disappeared. A young Swedish teenager was disappeared, and their governments got involved. And they sent money to Argentine human rights groups and publicized their work. The World Cup also happened in this period, and that got a lot of press for the human rights abuses happening. Amnesty International and the Human Rights Commission. There was a journalist by the name of Jacobo Timmerman who was Jewish, and he had been detained and tortured, and he wrote a book about his experiences called Prisoner Without a Name, Cell Without a Number. And this really forced the regime to go on the offensive, and they staged a public relations campaign in which they denied all of these human rights abuses. They said it was a campaign against Argentina. They hired a New York advertising agency to put together a huge spread in the New York Times that you can actually Google and see. And the U.S. was forced to respond as well. So Carter came, and he had his emphasis was on protecting human rights, and he had cut off some military aid. But then Reagan comes to power in 1980, and he agrees to restore military aid after the Argentine president offers to train the militaries in Central America, which are waging their own dirty wars, which are called civil wars, but was pretty same tactics of the dirty war against their citizens. It's in this context that the regime begins to lose its legitimacy. We'll talk more about this in the days to come, but the economy begins to spiral even further out of control. And one thing I want you to think about is, if we accept the idea, and I want to posit this in other classes, that dictators can't rule through fear alone, I want you to think about what helped the military hold it all together, why they stayed in power for so long, and then why ultimately they would lose their legitimacy. And this is something we'll talk about in particular next week in our final week of, it's not quite our final week of the class, but as we begin to wind down. Okay, that's all for this short lecture. I look forward to talking to you all soon.